Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I started writing papers about Syria in 2011, and I wrote maybe 300 pages about that time period, especially focused on Syria. And I stopped writing around the time of 2016, and I started writing again in 2020. This paper is written when I was 25 years old. This paper is 10 years old. This paper was written in August 17th, 2012, and there are three essays written on the 17th and the 18th of August in 2012. So I'm going to read the three papers. The first paper is Thinking in Terms of Should Be in Plights of Fantasy. When the image of how one should be in reality gets so far from the ideal, the individual may engage narcissism to compensate for the loss in respect to how one should be. The narcissism is an excuse-making schema where whatever the item which is a determinant to how one should be, the item that is the symbol of how one fell short of what should be, can represent the assignator of faults. Therefore, no fault of the person can be directly accepted for blame when the detrimental item is separate from the image of how one should be. All the blame is externalized in an imaginary realm. Those ideas of blame are circling around the object, which can be alternatively to be the assignator of the fault. This behavior or mental process is called malignant narcissism because the person who has fallen from their ideal image of how they should be is not accepting any responsibility for being less than they should be. All of the blame is externalized, and therefore all aggressive tendencies regarding the state of being less than the ideal is attempted to be justified by blame placing anything but this one individual who feels less than they should be. This is the modus operandi that the criminal officers in power use to achieve their political or military objectives when they know their objective would not be publicly acceptable. In order to not fall short of the objectives which may be publicly disapproved, the striving for achieving the objective in the most ideal way, meeting any public dissidence, makes a friction by which the aggressions of the striving may be accumulated. This is a modus operandi for the violent regimes. This is also how the representative of the violent regime will almost always 1. Deny any abuse occurred. 2. Deny any responsibility for the abuse that occurred. His striving for what he thinks should be is so strong, it makes an effect blocking against anything but having it. He is incapable of having any empathy because he is striving too strongly for what should be. No matter how violent the crime, he is denying that occurs. The idea of the person harmed is so vastly separated in his own mind for having obstructed his imagination of how he should be ideally, in this obstruction more and more his hatred for it he's building. He gets frustrated by the attentions drawn to him that he might be responsible for abuse because it's attacking his delusion that he is how he should be. His world in which he may be stretched far from reality in order to get the sense he is as he should be. What he feels should be becomes equated with righteousness by the delusion that what should be is the same as what is righteousness. His situational awareness is handicapped. All the ideas outside of that are comparatively puny area that can be viewed as an attacker of what is righteous if it challenges what he thinks should be, then self-central. This is known as the type of person who thinks they can kill with impunity. The more self-central he is, the punier he gets about what he should be, and the more he thinks it's a just cause, that he wants to destroy this object that's wrecking his contentedness, that he's got it as it should be. The word devil means a slanderer, accuser, the connector to why the most evil people will always claim that is in fact the one they victimize, who is the terrorist sympathizer, or criminal actor. In their puny self-central, there is a full righteousness they feel about what they should be. Also is the root of sadist tendencies, which are linked to the sexual sadism, because desire gets fused with wanting to hurt the item. Essay number 2. Unsupportable sense of self-importance and unsupportable sense of greatness. Anxiety is a feeling of anticipation to control what is feared as potential loss, shame, guilt, or embarrassment. Anxiety creates behavior of the person to minimize the effect something may have. The first technique is minimalization. Minimalization is an ego defense mechanism where the person tries to employ as many arguments in the mindset to make the threat seem lesser than their self, so as to proxy a sense of control over standing a thing. Narcissists will do whatever they can to reduce the value of the thing feared, which is the thing that could cause the narcissist to feel shame, guilt, embarrassment, loss of control over anything. The Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of Mental Disorder, published by the American Psychiatric Association, classify the most severe defense as the pathological defenses: psychotic denial and delusional projection. The moderate level defenses are immature defenses, projection, passive aggression, acting out, and fantasy. The low moderate level defenses are neurotic defenses: reaction formation, displacement repression, dissociation, intellectualization. The low defensiveness level, the mature defenses are anticipation, suppression, humor, altruism, sublimation. In extreme prolonged duration of stress, the psyche essentially has fantasies of overcoming what is the cause of the extreme stress. In fight or flight scenarios prolonged, survival fantasies develop. Annihilation anxieties are triggered by a survival threat. An extreme prolonged duration of compounding fight or flight distress, annihilation survival fantasies are constructed by the psyche. The imminence of vulnerability to strains increases the perceivable tolerance to them. The tolerance threshold to any sort of strain is jouissance. Jouissance is a psychoanalytic term for the pleasure-pain spectrum based on tension, which classifies the differentiation of masochists and sadists from minimal complaint, or from the basic pleasure or reward and pain principle. Closer to the tolerance threshold, the psyche is striving for discharge of the tensions. Fear of being overwhelmed, fear of being unable to cope, fear of merger or entrapment, fear of being devoured, each puts a subject in a sense of specific conditions. The sense of being in the conditions create accompanying psychological components, which are invested in the survival fantasy. The survival fantasy can be predominantly of the psyche with little connection to the outside reality, especially if the survival fantasy is made of components from childhood traumas. All psychological perversions are made of components from childhood experience, which detrimented the child's sense of self or the child's self-worth, hence created an unconscious survival fantasy. The survival of the child's sense of self-worth, which is the foundation of their identity. Grandiosity is a word to describe the character of something overblown from its actual significance. Grandiose character is manifest when the individual comes to develop their personality upon a concept of overvaluation. Whatever the symptoms of grandiosity of the character, the concept of what is being overvalued is embedded. The penchant for grandiosity is developed in childhood. The child's sense of self may be conflated with greatness of feeling some pointed sort of accomplishment. The reward for the grandiose is the feeling of greatness. The feeling of greatness may be derived from adulation they were rewarded with, recognition of specialness, or the fear inspired in others by the greatness. The trace components of grandiosity are the components which are amplified in any sort of survival fantasy. The psyche of a grandiose in a survival fantasy is volatile. In a fight or flight scenario, the development of the survival fantasy in the grandiose character is hypersensitized to the gravity of their situation. The grandiosity is unsupportable under weight of the gravity in circumstance. The survival of their sense of self that has been dependent on the feeling of greatness is made vulnerable. Therefore, the most predominating behaviors are the strivings for that sense of greatness to prevail, manifesting a particular set of conditions to form the fulfillment of the survival fantasy. Essay number 3. Grandiose entitlement neurosis in a sample of the criminal investigation of Bashar al-Assad. A neurosis is an obsessive compulsion to repeat a behavior. The obsessive compulsive repetition is caused by the striving of the psyche, desperate to get something. The sense of desperation is the fear of disrepair, to being overcome by the lack of the thing desired. The sense of urgency to prevent disrepair is the driver to the amount of recklessness acted out to obtain it. Recklessness is a narcissism in the state of blindness, whereby the actor aggresses on behalf of what is wished for. The central objectification to all acts committed by Bashar al-Assad symbolize an entitlement neurosis of Bashar. Bashar is acting out a compulsive neurosis in the effort to affirm his grandiose sense of entitlement over the land of Syria and the people of the land of Syria. The behaviors of his ministers and their allies also display symptoms of the grandiose entitlement neurosis, whereby they are in an extreme dissociative state in the efforts of their insistence that they are entitled to destroy and murder in retribution for the obstructions to what they believed they are entitled to. The entitlement neurosis is attempted to be naturalized by the Arab League, who all are compulsively retreating from the potential realization that they are displaying each their own symptoms of grandiose entitlement neurosis. Bashar al-Assad, not likely, could sustain command over the Air Force if more Stinger anti-aircraft missiles are supplied to the Free Syria Army. He has issued a threat in response that he, in turn, would supply the PKK with Russian SA-8 anti-air missiles. The threat is directed to the insistence of the MiG aircraft being shot down. The instance of the MiG aircraft being shot down, denoting that this is the undercurrent which the United States of America and Turkey had hesitated for, to impose the no-fly zones. Unfortunately, areas bombed by Bashar al-Assad in retribution have been the symbol for Bashar casting his own self off to the brink of no return. Bashar al-Assad's destabilization is making him reckless towards the sense of disrepair. To the civilians, it is walking on eggshells every day that Bashar al-Assad's disturbance of mind is prolonged. Allahu Akbar.